without any, if there are no questions from anybody on any of those points, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Shannon to introduce our guest today.
Hello, everyone. Can you guys hear me all right? Am I cutting out or anything?
Sound good.
Good morning, everybody. I hope everyone's ready for our speaker today. I'm so eager to get started. I have the pleasure of introducing Andy Brunelle and giving some background on his experience with forestry and many other positions. He is very experienced when it comes to making the world a better place. He has worked for the U.S. Forest Service for 25 years and has also been the Capital City Coordinator for 19 years. This makes me wonder how pleasant of a job it must be to work within the service of forests since he has been working in this field for so long. It was because he was so interested in the policy issues that he stayed in this field of work for so long, as well as feeling like he belonged in the position that he was in. The agency struggled with relationships and politics, and he knew the importance of it. So when Andy Brunelle was a special assistant for natural resources in the office of Idaho Governor Cecil D. Andrus, prior to coming to the U.S. Forest Service, he was faced with issues regarding the Forest Service agency and eventually got recruited to work with them after they approached Governor Andrus. Andy Brunelle was approached to do a 2-year study of the interior Northwest, which ended up lasting 6 years. After that, the U.S. Forest Service wanted him to stay on to help with state relations for them in 2001. He has also participated in a wide variety of natural resource issues, such as water quality, federal land management, and the protection of Snake River salmon. These are some pretty controversial topics. Mr. Brunelle has also worked with the Idaho Department of Water Resources, as well as Fish and Game, Lands, Parks, and Recreation, the Division of Environmental Quality, and for a small period of time served on the Northwest Power Planning Council. His civic engagement, meaning being an active part of society and politics, has included 4 years with the Boise City Planning and Zoning Commission and on the City of Boise advisory committees, helping to develop a master plan for the Boise River. He is also concerned with the management of the Boise foothills open space lands. Andy Brunelle currently serves on various boards of nonprofit organizations such as the Boise Watershed Exhibits Environmental Center, the Andrus Center for Public Policy, the Idaho Environmental Forum, the Harris Ranch Wildlife Mitigation Association, and the Ted Trueblood chapter of Trout Unlimited. Mr. Brunelle is also a BSU graduate from 1983, so he is no stranger to this school and its many facets. It is truly a pleasure to be introducing such an experienced advocate for the environment and our ecosystem. He has truly made a difference and deserves recognition for what he has participated in. It is a dream of mine to work with the U.S. Forest Service, so I am interested in what he has to say today. Without further ado, I introduce Andy Brunelle as our speaker today. Welcome to our class. I'm sure we are all interested in what you have to say.
Thank you, Sharon. Can people hear me okay?
Sound good.
Okay. Good.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I will do the screen share thing here. There, that should make it where you see it's filling the screen. So thank you for the invitation. Thanks, Mackenzie and Emily. I spent a good amount of time pulling this together from a lot of information that I've collected over time and direct experience with working for Governor Andrus back in the 80s and early 90s, and as the natural resource assistant to the former Secretary of the Interior under Jimmy Carter. It was quite the experience because obviously the governor knew these issues really well. He had been governor for 6 years and then Interior Secretary. That's back when I was in grade school and high school. When I finished up graduate school out of the University of Oregon, I came back to Idaho and I helped on his campaign and then ended up working in his administration. I studied problems of timber communities in Oregon and Washington as part of my master's graduate work over at Oregon. And so I had sort of an interest in forest issues, and especially some of the social issues related to community employment and social problems that develop in rural communities. So multiple use challenges for the Forest Service. Emily gave me this title and I said, yeah, I'm going to run with this one. I'm going to try to break this into 4 parts so that I don't go on and get too far off the field. But I'm going to first talk about some of the foundational elements in Idaho and how we became a state that is pretty dominated by the Forest Service lands in the state, and how the ideas of multiple use were attractive. And then I'm going to turn to the challenges and tell the story about logging and wilderness and how that played out in Idaho. And then a third one that has been nationwide in its complexity with dealing with all the different laws and rules that the Forest Service deals with in managing its land. And then really the last 15, 20 years, kind of the way forward as we've worked through a lot of these problems. And the new problems that have become much more apparent, like with climate change and fire. So first, a quick look at the National Forest System in Idaho. 20 million acres, or about 40% of the land area in Idaho, is under the National Forest System. You have 7 national forests that are headquartered in Idaho. We have about 1,800 employees full-time, and then with the seasonal work in the summer months for fire and for other field work, we go up to about 3,200 employees. The National Area Agency Fire Center, we are a part of that, along with BLM, Fish and Wildlife Service, Park Service, and other agencies. We have about 100 employees there. So the Forest Service is a pretty big deal in Idaho. Its history actually talks and speaks to the story of multiple use. At the beginning, you had the forest reserves, and this was an 1891 law that authorized the president to reserve from the public domain lands in order to preserve favorable water flow conditions, because there was concern about water flows in the summer becoming too low because areas, all the trees had been cut down, and you didn't have good water flows for agricultural uses, for farming, irrigation. And so Congress gave the president the authority to reserve lands. The map on the left shows by 1899, we had the Bitterroot Forest Reserve right there in north central Idaho. And then way up at the north end around Priest Lake, we had the Priest Forest Reserve as well. And then by 1905, after President Roosevelt got out the maps on the floor of the Oval Office and started drawing with Gifford Pinchot the areas that needed to be reserved, much more of Idaho became National Forest System lands. This caused quite a bit of controversy, and I think by 1908, Congress had taken away the ability for the president to, with the stroke of a pen, create national forests or forest reserves. But you can see by 1905, a good share of the state was already in the national forest, but more was to come. In that era, there was also the movement for interest in protection of lands and national parks. And I saw on your reading list the John Freemuth Cowley paper. I think it was called Tree Farms versus Mother Earth. And this is a little bit of the tree farm versus Mother Earth dichotomy you could see here. And I don't know if, can you see the cursor when I move it around? Okay. So the article on the left was really interesting. Like in 1905, Frank Finn was the first sort of statewide forester for Idaho National Forest. And he came to Boise and he said, you know, don't worry, these forest reserves, no interference with existing uses like grazing and mining and timber management. we're here to protect the forests. And so he was sort of using that multiple use language that people found attractive. Meanwhile, over the next decade, there was a move afoot to designate a Sawtooth National Park, which is that black area that you can see on the Idaho map. These are articles from the Idaho Statesman from 100 years ago that showed how the area would have been designated for a national park. Ultimately, it became a national recreation area, of course, and we'll get into that. By 1910, what was called the Big Burn, or the large fires of 1910, it really helped define the mission for the Forest Service nationally. And the map on the left shows the extent of all the burning in northern Idaho and western Montana, 2.5 million acres. Much of it within a weekend in August of 1910. You can see here a good part of Wallace, Idaho, that burned up in that fire, and a picture taken from the fire looking back into town. The little yellow arrow points to where my grandmother lived in 1910. She was a telephone operator and lived on 6th and Bank Street, and the fire burned up to the corner of 7th and Bank, so within half a block. These little red numbers are where she lived and her brother, and then my great-grandparents had a place up on Placer Creek just around the corner. Although that summer they were up in the Murray area. We all kind of pieced this together when the 100th anniversary of the Big Burn happened in 2010. Talking to my dad back then, there was a lot of family history in that area, but we just never really pulled it together. And once you get into places like Ancestry.com and start looking at old census reports and things like that, there's a lot of information you can find about your family. So in 1911, Congress responded to that fire by establishing the Weeks Act, which gave the Forest Service the ability to fight fires and protect the forests. And then a lot of the land you see in the eastern United States was land that was purchased back by the United States that had been cut over and left and needed to be reforested and some of the land restored. So on the western side, where there was public domain, a lot of that was reserved. On the eastern side, what you're looking at is land that was purchased. But it established the Forest Service as a national agency, decentralized to a degree, driven by science. After 1905, we continued to expand the forests in Idaho. East of McCall, the Thunder Mountain region, there were large fires in 1918, 1919. And this had, up to that point, because of all the mining in that area, there had been interest in continuing to have that area open as under the general lands. But after the fires, they said, no, this needs to go under the National Forest System. So it was added to the Idaho National Forest that already existed above. Meanwhile, here's a story from the 1920s of the people in the Boise area, Mountain Home area, asking Congress to add more national forest land. And part of this was to put the Idaho City area and areas south down almost to Mountain Home in the National Forest System. And part of it was to get control over grazing. And it was mainly the cattle grazing interests who wanted to see less sheep out on the range because there was always a fight over forage. But it was a form of support for the multiple use concept that the Forest Service was extolling at the time. This era continued through the 1920s and 1930s. We had what we do call the custodial era in the Forest Service. The Civilian Conservation Corps, which was part of the New Deal in the early 1930s, brought a lot of resources to where we were able to build roads and trails and bridges. And then at the same time, in the early 1930s, the Forest Service would use its own discretion to designate primitive areas, like this area here in central Idaho called the Idaho Primitive Area. It would eventually become part of the Frank Church Wilderness. But it was the Forest Service working with the governor at the time and wildlife groups that supported the Forest Service acting on its own discretion to protect some areas. After World War II, what we really saw was an acceleration of timber harvest on national forest lands. And you can see here in the 30s it being very low, but then it started to take off in the 40s. And then once President Eisenhower was in office and a businessman's approach was taken to national forest management, you can really see the increase in the amount of logging on national forests in Idaho. And it really shows that they were really taking multiple use really to an extreme. Or you might be saying maybe they were pushing it a little bit too much. Because at the same time, as we were harvesting timber off national forests to build suburbs, homes in suburbs across the United States, people began using the national forest more and more for their weekend outings and to get away from the cities that we were expanding. And so by the mid 1950s, the first legislation of wilderness was introduced in Congress. The response of the Forest Service at that time was, well, we need to keep pushing the multiple use language and vision to the people of this nation. And they proposed and ultimately got Congress to enact the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act in 1960. So the agency I work for saw it as this is a good way to respond to the single use proposals like wilderness legislation. And in some ways, it's sort of like marks the beginning of the end when you overtly say this is, we want multiple use, people begin to question it. And so I'm going to move into the second part here, where we talk about the challenges of multiple use. And it really comes down to, in this story that I want to talk about, especially in Idaho, was the logging versus wilderness battle that went on for many decades. So pictured here is President Johnson signing the Wilderness Act in summer of 1964. The people standing in the group include Frank Church. I think he is right here behind the people, the podium. And Senator Church was the floor manager in the U.S. Senate of the Wilderness Act. And he did take a lot of heat in 1962, but he was reelected even after supporting the Wilderness Act before it had been enacted. So Senator Church became an important player in the wilderness going forward. Up until 1964, we did have these 3 or 4 areas of primitive areas that the Forest Service had designated administratively. These are areas without roads, primitive in nature, the Sawtooth, Idaho Primitive Area, Salmon River Breaks, Selway Bitterroot. The Selway Bitterroot was actually designated as wilderness in the 1964 Act. So it was the first one in Idaho. But what really set up the conflict and the challenge for multiple use when it comes to using the lands for logging and for other uses was in the 1964 Wilderness Act, Congress said, we want the agencies like the Forest Service and the BLM to review all the roadless areas under their jurisdiction, and in 10 years send us a report on all of these roadless areas that are 5,000 acres or more, and then we will deal with all those areas. So here's the first 9 million acres of wilderness. Bring us back a report, and then we'll pass more bills. So it didn't take 10 years. It really played out over 40. And in Idaho, it also created new opportunities, and it changed the politics. So this is an interesting day in Idaho history. I put a picture of Cecil Andrus in his younger days with a large steelhead that he had caught in the Clearwater River. But in August of 1970, you have the political columnist in Boise saying, well, this has been a pretty lackluster primary campaign for governor. Meanwhile, a few pages down is this full page ad that says "Save the White Clouds" from a large open pit mining proposal. And within a week or so of this political column saying that the campaign was lackluster, Cecil Landris wins the Democratic primary for governor. 3 months later, he's elected governor of Idaho, November 1970, and forever changes Idaho history. For the first time, a governor who campaigned on saving the White Clouds on an environmental issue wins, ousting an incumbent governor who felt that an open pit mine at the base of Castle Peak was a good idea. Well, the people disagreed with that, and Cecil Landris became governor of Idaho in 1971. So wilderness areas got designated between 1964 and 1980, and you can see these on the left map: Sawtooth Wilderness, Hell's Canyon, Gospel Hump, 1978, the Central Idaho River of No Return Wilderness in 1980. But it didn't answer all of the needs that Congress had set out. Remember the 5,000 acre, give us a report in 10 years on roadless areas? Well, the Forest Service, we put those reports together. We did one in 1973 or 74. A lot of people didn't like it because we were really restrictive on what we defined as a roadless area. When President Carter was in office and under Cecil Landris, they ordered a new roadless area review be done. That ended up being challenged in court and was found inadequate. And eventually, when we rewrote our forest plans in the 1980s, we were finally able to address and assess all of these roadless areas. So meanwhile, while all of that is going on, we have all these areas, and the only areas that were open to road building and potential logging would be the areas you see in green in our national forests. So the pink and the yellow and the red are all roadless areas that were various parts of wilderness proposals. When Governor Andrus returned to the governorship in 1986, and I was out putting up yard signs for him and driving the campaign car where he would go shake hands at factory gates and things like that, he pledged that he and Senator McClure would take on the wilderness issue and essentially try to resolve what to do with all of these areas in pink and yellow. And so there were various proposals floating around. The Andrus-McClure bill proposed about 1.2 million acres. It also addressed trying to do multiple use in some areas where it would say logging was okay if you also closed the roads and gated them and then protected the wildlife afterwards. So the political opportunity that was there for designating wilderness was also creating gridlock, because for the forest industry and for the Forest Service, our ability to do a lot of logging projects was really limited to the areas in the green. And so that brought much of a, I guess you would say, sort of a confrontation between wilderness advocates and the forest industry. There was an emphasis on timber supply. It was a big deal. People knew that the national forest needed to, if we were going to continue to harvest the same amount of wood at the rate we had been, we were going to have to access those roadless areas. So in the end, it didn't happen because the gridlock continued, and you can see by the early to mid 90s a steep decline in the amount of timber harvest off national forests. So for about 1995 to 2001, it dropped quite a bit. And I kind of compare it to a Jenga tower, because Congress set forth the requirement that study these areas, don't manage them. We'll take care of that after you bring the proposals back to us. And so we would take a little block and put it on top, and take out another block, somewhere in the tower, and keep building the tower higher. At the same time, Congress was not deciding on the future of these lands whether they should be wilderness or whether they should be open for roading and timber management, they were still shoveling lots of appropriation dollars to the Forest Service to do, and they expected us to maintain a timber harvest somewhere in this level that you see in the 1980s. So it all kind of came tumbling down in the 1990s. And that, tells that story as far as the multiple use challenge when it came to what areas do we want to see managed as tree farms, as John and Mr. Cowley talked about, and what areas do we set aside sort of in that Mother Earth look. So I want to turn now to some additional issues and challenges for multiple use with the Forest Service. And the bottom three, the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, which I know you heard a lot about with Steve. Forget Steve's last name anyway. He had been here in Boise as the BLM State Director. It affects the Forest Service just as much. The Endangered Species Act in 1973 and the National Forest Management Act in 1976. These were all laws that made management and multiple use management even more complicated than it had been. So this is not wilderness versus timber management like I talked about in the last part. This is the land where you are going to be managing, building roads, facilities, doing some timber harvest. How are you going to do that and protect the environment? So it's not looking at the entire land base, it's just that piece that you can have that discretion to do it, but you need to do it right. So I think people have, I'm sure you got the dose from Steve Ellis about the importance of NEPA and the requirements of having alternatives to a proposal and taking a hard look at the effects of a proposal. And those were all requirements and policies that have built up over time. And there's a lot of case law that really affects how the Forest Service and the BLM and other agencies have to comply with the National Environmental Policy Act. So a lawsuit gets filed, we might win, we might lose, but usually when we lose, it sets precedent for the next EIS that comes along to make sure that we do it right. This little chart that the Idaho Forest Products Commission came up with kind of shows the different levels of environmental assessment versus environmental impact statement versus a categorical exclusion, about how some are a direct route to a decision, others take a much more circuitous route, and how much more complicated some of our activities can be. So clear cut logging and the spotted owl issue in Oregon and Washington. This really came to a head in the late 80s into the early to mid 90s. And what we saw there was the amount of logging that was going on federal lands in those western West Coast states where trees grow a lot bigger and a lot faster. There was a much larger forest products industry, and a lot of that money that Congress would appropriate to the Forest Service would go into those national forests on the west side of Oregon and Washington. And from a forestry perspective, clear-cut logging, a forester will tell you, is efficient. It doesn't look like a forest when you're done, but they'll tell you it's an efficient way to grow trees, is to clear the land and then replant. Well, that's fine as long as you're not taking into consideration other values and other important things like species habitat. And with the spotted owl, what we found was old growth forests were necessary for the spotted owl continuing to exist as a species. It's not all logging and versus habitat. It's not always logging. There's other uses on national forests that we run into issues with endangered species and complexity of the laws and complying with these laws. So down in Arizona on the Coronado National Forest, where you have the Mount Graham International Observatory. There's been long time litigation and challenges about how well or how poorly we manage the land there. And this is for an installation that is more science driven than just typically the management of forests for commercial timber. So I wanted to make the point that there are lots of different uses on national forests, and compliance with the law is very important. These charts show that over time, lawsuits started to grow in the late 80s and 90s, and were peaking in the late 90s. And then there's one year where there's a lot of litigation, but you can kind of see that it crests in the early 2000s and then starts to go down a little bit. And the year that the cases were closed or resolved, you can also see sort of a curve. So we were in an era in the 90s and early 2000s where litigation was really a challenge to multiple use management of national forests. But over time, the forests would get better at the analysis that we did to comply with NEPA and to comply with the National Forest Management Act and the Endangered Species Act. So back on the spotted owl old growth issue, this was one of the issues where it was really too big of an issue that the Forest Service couldn't resolve it alone. There were numerous attempts through regional guides, through forest planning, where we were trying to come up with some sort of strategy to continue to harvest timber and protect the spotted owl. Ultimately, President Clinton, when he was campaigning in 1992 in Oregon, he promised that he would come out and hold a summit and try to resolve the issue. The product was the Forest Ecosystem Management Assessment Team came up with a strategy to manage and protect fish and wildlife habitat in Oregon, Washington, and California. And what you see here is an ecosystem management approach taken to wilderness or to multiple use management. And it was a big deal. We were at the forest conference. There's the stock photo that I grabbed off the internet showing the president sitting around the table with cabinet secretaries and other people to speak. After the conference was over, the four governors, Governor Andrus, Governor Lowry of Washington, Governor Roberts of Oregon, Governor Wilson of California, met with the president and vice president. We got about 20 minutes with them in a back room. The guy over here sitting against the blue wall is me before I had gray hair, and had opportunity to sit in and observe that meeting all day and staff the governor on this issue. So by 1995, when I left the governor's office, the plan that the Clinton administration came up with to address similar issues on the interior side of the Northwest, so the east side of Oregon, Washington, and then all of Idaho, nearly, and much of western Montana, was through what was called the Interior Columbia Basin Ecosystem Management Project. And this was supposed to be a 2-year project to come up with a broad plan for that whole area, looking at forest health issues and protecting the salmon and wildlife, the fire issue, those kind of things. This is where I met and worked for Emily's dad, Jeff Middow, who was a BLM employee, and he was the deputy project manager on this project, and I was doing the intergovernmental relations and public affairs work. We produced a lot of reports. We produced a couple of environmental impact statements. Everybody hated it. Congress tried to kill the project twice. The ultimate outcome was we did complete the EIS about a week before President Bush took office, and then it sat for 2 years. No official decision was ever made from this project, but the scientific information actually still is in use and informs what we do today on the ground with management of our forests. by the early 2000s, the chief of the Forest Service, Dale Bosworth, was pleading with Congress that we needed to do something about the laws or get better, recognizing that it is a challenge to comply with all of these different laws that sometimes conflict with one another in order to implement projects on national forest lands. So where do we go from here? Well, the last 20 years, there's sort of been a change in direction. Collaboration, people getting together, trying to work at the local level to address issues that they see where they may have some things in common or where we can address multiple issues at the same time has been definitely one of the ways forward. The wildfire issue certainly has been a big deal. Dr. Freemuth, along the way, he was always never hesitated to voice his opinion, and here was challenging the Forest Service to say, do they really believe in collaboration, or is this an agency that still just wants to do its own science? And we would kind of dole out to the public, well, here's what we're going to do, and it's based on the best technical expertise out there. Multiple use still endures with other uses of the forests. Here's over the last 20 years, you can see the livestock use of the national forests is fairly steady. There are some years where it drops. Usually that's due to resting land after a fire to let the vegetation grow back. But for the most part, it's been a fairly steady use of the national forests in Idaho. We have about 4,000 special uses across national forests in Idaho for energy infrastructure and cabins, recreation residences, outfitting and guiding. And this just gives you an idea of on the different forests in Idaho, you have road systems and other things that we permit on national forests. And these, in my mind, this is really part of the multiple use picture. We may not think about it. You know, the telecommunications site at the top of this mountain over here, or the road that cuts through the bottom of the canyon over there that the county manages. But these are all uses of the national forest that are important as well. And obviously, recreation use of the national forest is a big and important multiple use. You can see the Sawtooth National Forest with the highest non-local recreation use on the forest. That's basically the ski area at Sun Valley. And Targhee National Forest, Caribou Targhee, that's a Targhee ski area. So you can see that a lot of our forests in Idaho attract non-local recreation users. Over time, what I've been involved in, we've also seen long-standing issues that have advanced towards resolution. So here on the left-hand side, from the early 80s, there was this big fight over the water quality regulations as they applied to national forests in Idaho, and how the State Environmental Quality Office would have rules for water quality to protect water quality in our streams and protect good fishing. And over time, we were able to resolve with the forest industry and with conservation organizations a strategy. Much of our forestry best management practices you find in field guides now. For example, this photo of the cover of a field guide handbook that is commonly used, and compliance is very high with the Idaho Forest Practices Act, and it's something where we made progress. So 21st century, I've added a few examples here of the new legislation that Congress stepped in and started addressing on forest policy that helps address some of our multiple use issues. As you can see, there was a big gap, almost 25 years, where Congress sort of, aside from passing some wilderness bills, they didn't really do much to change national forest legislation. The Healthy Forest Restoration Act in 2003 really responded to the fire issues that we were having in Idaho and across the West, and set up additional requirements and ways to do business to protect communities from wildfire. Stewardship contracting was authorized first in 1998 and then reauthorized and then made permanent in 2014. And it allows us to basically trade the value of timber to accomplish other work on the national forests. The Farm Bill brought the Good Neighbor Authority and brought state government into more coordination with Idaho. And then wildfire funding legislation in 2018 that Congressman Simpson helped push through, we hope will address some of our funding issues. So over the last 50 years, here's a chart showing wildfire acres on the national forest, and you can see it really started to take off 1988, and then every few years, are punctuated by these really big fire years. 2007, 1.2 million acres, 2012, almost 1 million acres burned. And then when we don't have a big year, we still get a couple 100,000 acres. So this is sort of the new normal as it applies to Idaho National Forests. Compare that to back here in the 1970s, where in a lot of the years there just wasn't hardly any fire at all. So I think what you're seeing here are two things. One is climate change. It's affected the weather and the length of seasons and how trees and brush dry out and are vulnerable to fire longer. So climate change is one factor. The second is we were so good at fire suppression from really 1910 until 1980 or so that a lot of fuel built up on the ground. And while some of that was logged off, the money is in the big trees, not in clearing the brush. And so the buildup of fuels really had an effect on stoking the fuel for the fire in these big years. And so we're sort of in this new normal of 100,000 to 200,000 a year of acres burned on national forests. This is what it looks like cumulatively, some 8 million acres that have burned. And you can see that really since 2005, about half of it came really in the last 15 years. Within the agencies, one of the things that we're recognizing more is it's not about the volume of the timber that we sell for wood, for homes and lumber, but it's about the amount of acres that we can manage and bring in to better condition by thinning. And the yellow bars here are prescribed burning, where we set fires in the spring and the fall to address this accumulation of fuel and to improve wildlife habitat. Forest collaborative groups in Idaho really started to take hold in the last 10 or so years. Down here at the bottom, I have a headline that shows the collaborative forest partnerships are an effective mechanism for helping get projects done on the ground. That study came out and was released just earlier this week by the policy analysis group at the university. The Idaho Forest Restoration Partnership has talked about a zone of agreement on forest restoration, how collaborative groups focus on forest resilience, that we agree what to do in dry forests, the thinning and hazardous fuels reduction, and the emerging agreement on how to deal with moist and cold forests in the higher elevation. The roadless rule in Idaho that was adopted in 2008 really helps us move past a lot of the old controversies. The forest industry that remains is an important element in Idaho. And then one of the important things is a lot of our projects are address not only forests, but also watershed issues to improve habitat for fish and wildlife, and that's important. Finally, I wanted to speak a little bit to John's role in all of this. John Freemuth was a longtime friend, and in preparing for this, I went back and looked through all my old emails, did searches, and I would say most of our emails back and forth didn't involve policy issues so much as maybe sports or, hey, did you see this article? And look what's going on here. John was an important person in my life and in my professional role with the Forest Service, because in some ways he understood the policy aspects from an academic perspective that were very important to help me see past the day-to-day work that I do in government relations or working within the agency, to think about over the long term how public land management has evolved, how it has gotten better in some areas, and how there are the new challenges that we face with climate change and with fire and with new technology that puts more people into the forests in different ways. So a couple of pictures here. The one at the upper right is one of the Idaho Forest Restoration Partnership annual meetings that we would hold. We're doing those virtually now. In fact, John helped moderate the last one just a couple of weeks before he passed away. In mid-April, we took our annual meeting and did it virtually. And then back in 2014, it was pretty funny. We had a Idaho Forest Restoration Partnership meeting in February that year. John was the moderator. Senator Crapo said he would come by. And then it turned out that the other 3 members of the Idaho delegation didn't have anything better to do. And so they all showed up and they all spoke to the group, 100, 120 people there. And I have an email from John that's kind of funny, where he was just saying, he goes, "I can't believe I ended up in that situation where here I am with on one side the chief of the Forest Service and a couple of regional foresters, and then the Idaho delegation right there where I was holding court with them." So John played an important role in our agency. He was a frequent speaker at regional leadership meetings, and kept his active monitoring and support for helping us through on many of our problems. So I've gone a little bit long, about 3 or 4 minutes, but I think that's what I wanted to present today. So I'm going to hit the stop share.
Fantastic, Andy. That was a masterful presentation. I love the mix of both personal photographs and the incredible visualizations in the maps and in the charts, but also the historic newspaper. So please join me in thanking Andy for putting that together and for giving us such a clear panorama of some of the issues with multiple use in the Forest Service in Idaho. It was also fun to see the icy bump documents. Man, there were a lot of those around my house. I remember when those came out. So that's fun to see. There have been a number of really great questions from students that have come up, and I think the last slide with the tribute to John was particularly impressive. So I'll go ahead and let Chris and Alyssa Cepeda ask their questions about collaboration, and we can start from there, and then we'll head into some of the other issues as well.
Sorry, Chris, do you want to go first?
No, by all means, take the lead.
So I was wondering, collaboration is something we hear about a lot as the most common solution to multiple use conflicts. So what do you think are the biggest challenges when it comes to the collaborative approach? And do you think that there's a good balance today between multiple use interests?
So John, that article that he wrote in 2010, and really a lot of his contributions, if you go back, and I've looked at some of the literature, at least what I can get my hands on, one of the biggest challenges was and continues to be my agency, because we have a culture in government agencies, and especially the Forest Service, that he would point out that there was always this "we know best" attitude, and it's gotten better. In fact, I would say it's gotten a lot better over the last 20 years, that I think we finally got over ourselves a little bit, but there's always that, I guess, that sense of the professionalism, the being trained in forestry, the kind of the traditional approach was, well, we know more, we're entrusted to, we should have the discretion to figure these things out. So that's one challenge. The second was, and I would apply this to the across the continuum of different interests. We spent a generation or more advocating for our special interest. And so I think it's hard for the forest industry to put themselves and to emphasize with what the conservationist is feeling or is concerned about when it comes to protection of wildlife or open space or just areas left to be a forest where natural processes can predominate. And at the same time, the environmental movement, especially, and I saw this especially in the era of the spotted owl in Oregon, was they did a great job of demonizing the forest industry and the forest workers in particular. And politically, they were able to prevail, but it left a lot of, I think, ill will. My theory is it sort of created the first Trump voters in this country, that it took people who worked and lived in rural areas who were traditionally voted Democratic because they were labor union workers, and they became alienated. And I was talking to Emily a couple of weeks ago. There's a great podcast that Oregon Public Broadcasting recently released that tells the story of the timber wars in Oregon, and the story comes through there. It's just about that challenge that is still there. That there's still ill will and bad feelings over how that evolved. So those, I would say, are the biggest challenges.
Question number 2. What would you say is maybe a relationship that you constantly have to go back to, or one of the more important relationships that you've built in forest management?
So in my day-to-day position, it's really the I would say it's really the work with the people in the interest groups across the waterfront, that you have to stay in touch with them. You have to listen, and in some ways do what you can to sort of show that the agency is responsive. Yeah, I do a lot of work with state government agencies, and I talk to the governor's staff people and the congressional staff people pretty constantly, but they are responding to what they're hearing from the citizens. And so they're not going to be the last word. It really comes back to those interests and the relationships we need to have for our agency with groups like Idaho Conservation League, with the forest industry, with the different companies, and with the Cattle Association. And then we need to be looking at, as well as hiking and off-road vehicle interests. So I think it's really, don't just do your intergovernmental work, also talk and have that relationship to where you can pick up the phone and talk to these people. I can't have coffee with these people like I used to since March, or beer after work, but that in my mind is, as a government employee, it's talking with and working with the people directly.
Fantastic. Our urban studies major, Brendan, has a question that has to do with planning. I think land use planning, but I think sort of more broadly. So Brendan, I'll go ahead and let you ask that how you would like to.
Perfect. So I know you had mentioned rather briefly that you there was a lot of planning involved with forest restoration. And I was just curious if you are aware of any current long-range plans or comprehensive action plans within the just general Northwest area that are doing, or rather are planning for I guess, restoration or preservation of forested areas or green spaces?
So my agency is tied down under National Forest Management Act pretty tightly to developing land and resource management plans that are very comprehensive. They have to be for the entire national forest, and they're useful and they're pretty good. They set the limitations on what we can and cannot do. But I still think that there's sort of that missing element of that I think you might be getting at, a long-range plan that looks into the future for a specific area that has the support of that might have the support of the people in that local area. And I still think that that's, we have good species plans that different agencies do. Idaho Department of Fish and Game does. And we do our best to try to integrate those plans through our national forest land and resource management plans. But they're pretty big and complex that it's hard to know how well you're doing. I think one of the things you will see as we are emphasizing under shared stewardship with the state of Idaho, we have picked a couple of what we call landscape priority areas. And there's going to be one here that we'll be emphasizing that is from the Sage-Hen area up north towards Council and New Meadows. And it's the Southern Idaho Landscape Stewardship. And we're going to be looking across different ownerships. And I'm hopeful that that's going to do a better job than just looking at what we do on our lands. So I would say let's keep an eye on that one as we develop that strategy for managing that block or that area.
All right, fantastic. Thank you.
Stephanie, you had a couple questions, but I'll let you go ahead and ask. I think a good follow-up here would be the question about the white clouds and the sort of delay in that process. I think Andy probably has some neat insight into that.
Yeah, so I am introducing Rick Johnson next week, who was involved, I believe, in the White Clouds Wilderness, the designation. So when you mentioned that Cecil Andrus was used that, while running in the 70s, if I'm correct, it wasn't designated until 2015. So I was just curious why you think it might have taken so long.
So Andrus gets elected in 1970, in part because of the White Clouds Wilderness issue. At the same time, we were starting to see and had the concern about development of the Stanley Basin, the Sawtooth Valley area, which is to the west, where Stanley is, and that beautiful area. Congress did act in 1972, so they sort of took the first half of the equation did get addressed immediately, well, within 2 years. The Sawtooth National Recreation Area Act was passed. And in that legislation, they included a congressionally mandated study of the White Clouds for wilderness. And we'll come back and address it in Congress. Now, why did it take 35 years? Why did it take until 2015? I think part of it was the conservation movement in Idaho had bigger areas that they wanted protected, like the River of No Return. Senator Church emphasized that in 1979 and 1980. And the River of No Return wilderness did get protected. And then Senator Church was defeated in the 1980 election. And there was no champion to do additional wilderness that would come back and take care of the White Clouds. Andrus and McClure tried, but the White Clouds was part of that bigger statewide legislation that was proposed in 1987, 1988. So it would have, if there had been just a White Clouds bill in the late 80s, I think it would have, they would have been able to get it passed. But because they were looking at a statewide bill, the White Clouds was not a controversial part. It was other places in Idaho that were more controversial that brought that bill to a halt, so it didn't become law. And then it took time to find the next person who would champion protecting the area. And that person became Mike Simpson. You know, he wasn't elected to Congress until 1998. But within 3 or 4 years, he had a bill, you know, that he was starting to work through the process. And he came really close in 2006. And but for some last minute maneuver that Rick Johnson can probably tell you about, in 2006, we would have had a White Clouds wilderness. But with that setback, it added 10 years. So that's a long answer to why something didn't happen. There were sort of all of these attempts that were being made, but they would fall short along the way until 2015. And Cease, he got involved in that as well because it was finally thought that, well, if we're not going to get a wilderness out of it, let's get it designated by President Obama as a national monument. And so it was the threat of a national monument designation that finally said, oh, okay, we'll do a wilderness bill. And the rest of the Idaho delegation came along.
Cool, thank you very much.
The negotiation is such an interesting process. Let's go to Alyssa Molis, who had a couple questions. One of them was about bark beetles, but another was about prescribed burning and fuels management a little bit more broadly. Alyssa, would you like to ask those for us, please?
Oh yeah. So my first question, I'm really curious. I don't know if you even know anything about this, but like the bark beetles issue, like specifically like in like the Boise forest with like ponderosa pine, like do you know anything about the Forest Service's plan to like manage that, or, like mitigate the risk?
We are currently dealing with some tussock moth outbreaks in the Emmett, north of the Emmett area, along the sort of North Fork Payette River in the mountains there above that canyon.
Mm-hmm.
So the road from here to Cascade. Bark beetle issues, insect and disease is a natural process in forests. Some of the outbreaks can be uncharacteristically large or can be a bigger problem than sort of the natural cycle of insect and disease mortality that you see happen to trees. A lot of that was probably caused by the fire suppression or the exclusion of fire. We ended up with too many trees per acre and sometimes the wrong species of tree that helped feed the bark beetle problem. So the practices that we're bringing in to thin a lot of these forests so that when we're done, it's not just totally leveled clear cut, but we're thinning the smaller trees out in some situations and creating different clumps of trees that are left and other areas where you remove them. And that helps address some of the bark beetle problems. Prescribed burning. We are doing more prescribed burning than we used to, and we need to do a lot more than we are doing now. In fact, that Interior Columbia Basin project, that really started to crystallize on the fire issue, that we needed to actively manage more acres, but do it in a lighter touch. And in a lot of situations, the best thing to do would be to plan and put into place prescribed burns in some of the areas. And that's an important way to help prevent a forest fire in the future from being more severe. If you can burn off the understory or the fuels below the trees. So prescribed burning, we're doing a fair amount, maybe 25,000 acres a year on average in Idaho. We'd like to double that to 50,000 acres of prescribed burning.
Isn't there? I don't know if it's for Idaho, but when I go camping in other states, I look on the public forest websites, and it says not to bring wood in from out of state or out of the area. Is that kind of the same premise of prevention of infestation?
Yes. Trying to remember how many years ago we started really pushing that. But there's evidence that firewood that you would bring from home, maybe you harvested it, with the firewood permit in the forest and then brought it home. We don't want you to bring that wood from home with you when you go camping, because there may be insects that have bored into those pieces of firewood that could then escape and affect the forest in the area where you're camping. So we try to promote local sources of firewood that would be available. Say if you're up in the Sawtooth, making a purchase at one of the lodges or one of the gas stations that sells firewood. Like with many invasive species, we're trying to do a better job of managing and preventing their spread through making sure that we don't have that we're not transporting weeds into places where currently we're weed free, and in this case with firewood, not bringing firewood from the home back into the forest where you could have an effect on the forest.
We have a few other questions from students that haven't gotten asked, Alyssa Wolf or Riley, but I want to open it up at this point. We probably have room for 2 more questions to some of our guests as well, or Mackenzie, if you have a question, and you all know I have 10 in my pocket if you don't have them. So if anybody'd like to pipe up, please do.
Sure. I'm curious about the Forest Reserves Act. We always talk about national monuments and how they were designated by the president, and people get upset about that. But do you have any sense of how many national forests were started from the Reserves Act?
I would say about 80% of the land. Actually, John and I were researching this a couple of years ago because we were trying to figure out who gets more credit for land protection. Is it the executive branch or is it Congress? And so from 1891 to 1908, a president had the power to reserve from the public domain, from the public land domain to the into the forest system. And I would say maybe about 80% of the land got protected or got reserved. The other 20% came after 1908 in congressional acts and in acquisitions like in the eastern United States. There's actually a list though, if you want it.
Yeah, I would love it. That was something John and I talked about too. I never figured it out. So.
Yeah.
Thank you.
With some colleagues, we're trying to figure out a similar question for national parks in South America. And, were they mostly done by the executive branch, or were they mostly created by sort of a larger push, either through Congress or locally? And that relates to my question, which is I interviewed the head of the Ministry of the Environment for Peru 5 or 6 years ago. And he told me that the biggest change he's witnessed in how the environment within Peru was managed came from the switch in bureaucrats. So it used to be that scientists became appointed and had agencies and made decisions. And now, or according to him, in the last 20 years, it's been lawyers. And so that shift in training has necessitated a really different approach to the environment. And I'm curious, based on the statement you made about the peak of lawsuits being in the 1990s, if a similar transition has happened within US agencies, and if there are, and I could probably find the data somewhere, more lawyers than scientists sort of running the forests these days.
There was a shift. I think I missed it in my notes, but after NEPA was enacted and Endangered Species Act, it led to the federal land agencies hiring a lot more different disciplines. So in the Forest Service, instead of just hiring more foresters and road engineers, we started hiring wildlife and fisheries biologists, botanists, and other disciplines. And that was necessary in order to have a multidisciplinary approach to analyzing a proposal that you need to do to comply with NEPA. And so that diversified the workforce in the national, in the Forest Service, definitely by profession, and probably some by gender as well. And that had an effect. By the early 90s, there was a group out of Oregon called Association of Forest Service Employees for Environmental Ethics. And it was Forest Service employees, and they're still around. It was employees who were like, I'm not entirely cool with the direction this agency has gone with the heavy emphasis on timber management. There's a great book, A Conspiracy of Optimism, that Paul Hurt, historian, wrote, that chronicles some of this, how there was basically an insurrection within the Forest Service to do a better job of how we manage the lands. And so I think that professionalism was going on starting in the 70s and really accelerated through the 80s. I don't see the role of attorneys and lawyers, since that's really, we have legal advice in the Department of Agriculture through what's called the Office of General Counsel. But when we get sued, we are represented by the U.S. Attorney, which is part of the Department of Justice. And so they have its own environmental section. And it would really be the growth in environmental litigation that came from the conservation groups and the establishment of the Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund, that brought on attorneys to basically file objections or appeals or litigation where necessary. The version of it that we have here in Idaho is called Advocates for the West, and they represent a lot of the conservation groups in Idaho in a lot of legal issues. So it was really, I would say, the role of the lawyers was more outside the agency than inside.
Super interesting. Thank you. Class, please join me in thanking Andy, silently or loudly, however you would like to, for this wonderful talk. I think we'll stay on the call for a couple minutes, but I know several of you have classes that you need to get to and work and other things. But thank you all for joining us this morning and for this wonderful conversation. This is one of the weirdest things that comes out of Zoom, right? Is watching everybody magically sort of fly away and disappear.
If it's okay to take a couple more minutes of your time, I did have one more question.
Sure.
Yeah, in your introduction, Shannon mentioned that you work to protect the Snake River salmon, and that's what I've been working on for my final project in this class. I've been researching, and I'm just kind of curious how, like in that research, it looks like there's a lot of money that's been spent and a lot of like legislation or plans that have been drafted that have been unsuccessful. And I'm just kind of curious, like, especially with all of the different energy sources that we have other than hydropower, why there's so much opposition to removal of dams in the Northwest, or why you think that is.
There's a lot of reasons. The hydropower industry in the region is very influential. Bonneville Power Administration, which is a federal agency, is very influential with the congressional delegation in Oregon and Washington, especially Washington. And the reason is most of the electricity generated by the Federal Columbia River power system is consumed in the state of Washington. And so there's always been a lot of opposition to changes in the Columbia River system that could benefit the salmon. So, like the issue with removing the 4 lower Snake River dams, the state of Washington has not been supportive, and you would think they would be, but like the U.S. Senators, Patty Murray and Cantwell, have been opposed to it in part because the benefits, i.e. more fish coming back, the fish would return to eastern Oregon and central Idaho. But the loss of the electricity that would have to be replaced would impact Washington. So there's sort of this spatial resource thing that's playing out. So a couple of years ago, the whole thing about the orcas and how the orcas were becoming more in the news because of the dependence on the salmon that the orcas eat, is for the first time, or not the first time, but it's another kind of chink in the armor of Washington saying, oh, the Snake River system, that, it's out there in southeast Washington, it's important for the shippers, but there's really no benefit of bringing the salmon back there because the salmon end up in another state. So I think that's a big factor, is how the state of Washington is approaching the issue. I've thought about this a lot, and I worked on the salmon issue for the governor in the early 90s when the salmon were first put on the endangered species list. One thing I've observed over time is it was a lot easier through litigation and other political efforts to stop the Forest Service from logging old growth forests than it is because you can stop it. You can stop doing something that's destructive to fish and wildlife habitat. With hydro system, there's no off button. You would have to act to actually take the dams away. So they're there, and there's no way to stop them. And the way they're operated, you have to operate them. You can't just let all the water spill over the dams, because that would would oversaturate the water with too much gas bubble disease and those kind of things. So you sort of have to operate the system as it's currently configured. So it's always going to be a bigger challenge. And this is one reason CEAS always said, well, yeah, it'd be the right thing to remove the dams, but it'll never happen, because it's one thing to recognize that something's a blight. It's another thing to say we're going to do something about that blight and fix it. And maybe we'll get there. We'll see. We are removing dams that are no longer in use, like on the Elwha. There's a great story in the Seattle Times this past week about the Elwha dam removal and what's happening with the fish returns. So I think that's those are kind of some of the factors that I think about on that.
Those are all really good points. Thank you. Thanks for
Great question, Stephanie. Thank you. Jessica or Christopher, do you guys have other questions too?
No.
I was just hanging out.
Okay, well, that's awesome. That's great. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you so much for the talk. I'll see you guys.
Yeah, if there's any other questions on that chat that you want to email me, just let me know. And thanks again for the opportunity to be part of this kind of homage to John and a lot of his good work over the years.